I think Edgar Wright's Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a great film, but my least favorite thing about it is its handling of Ramona Flowers, especially when compared to the source material, and in particular the way it portrays her relationship with Scott Pilgrim. Scott Pilgrim is fundamentally a love story, albeit an unconventional one, and the success of any love story hinges on its audience's willingness to root for its central relationship to succeed. There are exceptions, but when a film's narrative is carried entirely by its will they or won't they, which Scott Pilgrim's is, it's crucial to provide your audience with reasons to want its leads to end up together. Otherwise, why would we give a shit about seeing Scott defeat Scott Pilgrim's iconic 7 evil exes? I simply don't enjoy seeing Scott and Ramona on screen together in the films, which isn't the case in the books, and I can think of no clearer illustration why than their first date. Let's start by comparing the scenes where Scott asks Ramona out to begin with. In both versions, Ramona emerges from Scott's Nightmare on Elm Street dream, knocks on his door, and Scott asks her out. Ramona says, "No, that's okay," and Scott tells her he just saw her in his dream. In the graphic novel, however, Ramona seems regretful at not having recognized Scott sooner. She's a little sheepish about the fact that she's been using his head to make her job easier. In the movie, she explains all this very matter-of-factly, like she either can't understand or doesn't care why this could be seen as a violation, even though both Ramonas know just how intrusive it can feel to have another person inside your head without invitation. Following this, book Ramona's a lot more willing to speak with Scott, and she seems a lot more engaged by the conversation. She actually asks him questions, which movie Ramona doesn't do a single time throughout the whole scene. She starts trying to explain subspace highways to Scott when he asks, and even if it's just because she feels bad about her actions, which again is something unique to the comic, her words and body language don't communicate discomfort. Book Ramona doesn't come across as desperate to get out of there as soon as possible. She's not being held captive at his front door, she's making conversation. When Scott asks Ramona if she's American, Ramona seems concerned that she's coming across as rude. Movie Ramona clearly has no such concerns. When Book Scott reminds Book Ramona of their meeting at the party, Ramona blushes and apologizes. She immediately understands why Scott was behaving the way he was that night, and clearly feels some responsibility for it, which causes her embarrassment. She has a moment of self-awareness about the way she's been treating someone. This doesn't happen to movie Ramona once until the very end of the movie. You could suggest that the filmmakers committed to focusing on her other character traits so that her central qualities were emphasized to make them more focal for the viewers. But to me, this just removes some of Ramona's complexity and flattens her out as a character, and the cost of that is that I care about her less. The qualities of Ramona that they removed were her likable ones. And like I mentioned earlier, you're supposed to like her, or you won't want Scott to get with her, which means you won't care whether he defeats the evil exes or not. And in that case, why would you want to watch the film at all? In both versions, after being reminded of the party, Ramona tells Scott, "You need to sign for this," and Scott says, "But if I sign for it, you'll leave." Here's where one of the biggest changes between the book and the movie happens. Book Ramona smiles. Movie Ramona doesn't smile once throughout the entire film, except mockingly. I'm not saying women need to smile more, but my point is that Ramona doesn't seem happy at a single point throughout the film. She never seems to enjoy the time she's spending with Scott. Again, this calls into question why they're dating, and again, it calls into question why we should want them to be. We'll come back to this.
I say yes, we sign for your damn package.
This line isn't present in the comic at all. Movie Scott essentially takes Ramona hostage, then gently blackmails her into agreeing to go on a date with him. In the comic, Scott asks Ramona to hang out with him. She asks, "You want me to hang out with you?" He goes, if that's cool. And Ramona goes, "How about tonight? Is tonight okay with you?" There's no threat of withholding his signature and making Ramona's job harder. Ramona isn't forced into their date. There's willingness on her part.
And hey, ladies, listen. Take it from me. The point I'm trying to make here isn't that you're obligated to try and make polite conversation with some guy if he's making you uncomfortable. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. Scott, at points, is kind of a creep to Ramona. In a real life, in a real world, I think if a guy like Scott was acting the way Scott acts towards a girl like Ramona, or towards any girl, that girl would be well within their rights to avoid that guy at all costs. I would think that would be a perfectly okay thing to do. But the thing you gotta understand is, I'm not saying how Ramona should act if this was happening to her in real life. This is a movie. Scott Pilgrim is a movie and a comic book. And the filmmakers who made the movie wrote the movie to make Scott and Ramona get together. And I think if they wanted the audience to want Scott and Ramona to get together, which I think they did because the movie's about Scott and Ramona getting together, they maybe shouldn't have written the relationship in such a way that makes it feel like Scott's a creepy guy who she would want to try and get away from. You know what I mean? Like, if a guy was acting the way Scott is acting to you in real life, you'd probably want to avoid him and move away from him. And so that if they want to make a movie about a couple you want to see get together, maybe they shouldn't have made Scott act like that.
As a complete aside, I like the way Scott writes his signature. He writes his first name all neat and tidy, but he clearly hasn't planned how much space he should leave to write his surname, and so he has to kind of cram it all in at the end. It's funny. Something interesting about reading Scott Pilgrim when you're younger than all of the characters, then rereading it when you're older than all of them, is that as a 28-year-old kind of sort of girl who used to be an 18-year-old kind of sort of boy, I've been both Scott and Ramona in this situation. I understand what it's like to fixate on a girl and try to exhaust every possible option to get her to develop an interest in you before giving up. To be clear, you shouldn't do that. No means no. You should respect women's wishes, and if a girl tells you she's not interested, you should believe her. But I know what it's like to be Scott here. What's more interesting to me, though, is that now, as a marginally good-looking adult, I understand Ramona's perspective. Comic Ramona's, to be clear. Ramona's moved to a completely new city where she doesn't really know anybody, and this weird, eager, probably mostly harmless guy wants to spend time with her. I can relate to being in a position of having no one else to really hang out with and nothing else I'd really rather be doing and going, why not? Let's see what happens. I can completely buy Comic Ramona agreeing to hang out with Comic Scott out of a sense of curiosity more than anything else. Nothing in the same scene in the movie leads me to believe that movie Ramona would even consider showing up for that date. In the graphic novel, Ramona smiles when she sees Scott arrive for that date. She grins at him while making fun of his dorky X-Men patch. She's making fun of him, but it feels friendly. When Scott asks her about Gideon, she smirks and changes the subject, asking Scott a question about himself instead. She laughs when she correctly deduces that Scott and Wallace share a bed together. Scott says he feels stupid, and Ramona tells him, "You're probably not that stupid." They have a rapport. The time they're spending together feels like it's enjoyable for both of them. Both keep asking questions about one another and answering them openly. It truly feels like they're getting to know one another, and neither come across as bored or uncomfortable. The movie's not like that. When Scott tells Ramona he assumed she was too cool to be there for the date on time, and Ramona tells him,
You assumed wrong.
she comes across as irritated. When Gideon comes up, instead of the smooth tact displayed by Comic Ramona in rerouting the conversation to be about Scott instead, Ramona goes,
Do you mind if we don't get into that right now?
She's way more upfront with her discomfort and clearly feels as though Scott's stepping on some of her toes. I'd like to make it clear that if you're on a date with someone and they make you uncomfortable, you're well within your rights to say so. This is a movie, though, and every scene, every line, and every performance in a movie is meant to communicate something. When Ramona clearly communicates that this date is making her uncomfortable, it calls into question why she would want to continue dating Scott afterward. This is just one small hiccup, but we don't really get an answer to that question. All we get are more hiccups. Remember in the comic how Ramona spends basically the whole date smiling and laughing? Here's what happens in the movie when Scott tries making a joke.
Just time to head somewhere a little more chilled.
Well, it's certainly chilled here.
Yeah.
It's chilled as in cold.
Yeah.
Like, look at this, look at this, look at this. This is how she acts in the comic. This is how she acts in the movie. Another thing I'd like to make clear is that I don't blame Mary Elizabeth Winstead for any of this. Mary Elizabeth Winstead is a great actress, and she absolutely has the range to play fun and likable characters. It's not like she just started acting all mean and one-dimensional on set one day, completely of her own accord, and Edgar Wright yelled, "Great, let's go with that!" On the contrary, I think Mary Elizabeth Winstead does an excellent job playing Kim Pine. Also, this song sounds kind of like Stars by Car Seat Headrest, right? Like, I'm not like imagining that, am I? When Comic Scott says this whole thing is an unmitigated disaster, and Comic Ramona says, I think Act of God is a decent excuse for a lousy date, they're both beaming. They didn't have a lousy date. They had a great time hanging out with each other. When Movie Ramona says,
I think Act of God is a pretty decent excuse for a lousy date.
she means it. The date was lousy, and it wasn't because of the weather. She and Scott just didn't enjoy the time they spent together. If two people who like each other go on a date, bad weather can't ruin it. But if they don't like each other, the weather has nothing to do with it. Whatever the case, Ramona invites Scott back to her apartment. He gets cold, he goes looking for a blanket, and he walks in on her changing. In both the comic and the movie, Ramona comes closer, and she and Scott start to kiss. The feeling is completely different, though. It's not that I don't buy Movie Ramona banging this guy she just went on a lousy date with. It's just that I don't buy that she really wants to. Sometimes you really hit it off with somebody. You end up in a situation where you're presented with the option of intimacy, and you decide spontaneously to do the fun thing, with little regard for where things might go after that. That's Comic Ramona. And sometimes you go on a shitty date with someone, end up in a situation where you either could sleep with them or not sleep with them, with both options holding roughly similar appeal, and you think, hey, might as well. That's the kind of situation the movie reminds me of. They're both entirely realistic situations, I know that all too well, but the key difference is intent. One of them arises as a product of fun and a good time, and maybe even hope for the future, and the other occurs as a result of boredom. There is a crucial difference between, hey, why not? And, hell, why not? Also, Scott's kind of hot here. Like, this is like a hot thing to say. This is like smooth. This is a smooth thing to say. This is a thing a guy I would want to have sex with would say. This is what Scott says in the movie.
I can not have to.
There's another very minor change in the movie that isn't hugely important, but it strips Ramona of just a tiny little bit more characterization, so I'd like to mention it here. So there's this moment in the comic where they're about to bang, and Scott goes, I'm not sure if and Ramona immediately cuts him off and goes, I changed my mind. I don't want to have sex with you right now. This tells us something about her. Partly, it's a matter of pride. By sliding in there before Scott can, Ramona gets to be the rejecter rather than the rejectee, which allows her to avoid feeling undesirable, even if it's only by technicality. I know a lot of girls can relate to this, but more importantly, it lets us know how important Ramona's sexual agency is to her. It's crucial for her to feel like she's the one in control of her sexual encounters, even extending as far as being the one in control of not having them. This is actually very important foreshadowing, and it subtly alludes toward an element of her and Gideon's relationship, which, while never outright stated, is hinted at heavily in the later books. In the movie, the scene goes like this.
I changed my mind.
Changed it to what? From what?
I don't want to have sex with you, Pilgrim. Not right now.
Scott never hints at not being ready to have sex with Ramona, and so Ramona loses that small element of characterization. It's just one line, but it contributes to the filing of her character down to this boring, one-note, mysterious mean girl. It's not just that I don't like watching Scott and Ramona's relationship. It's that I don't buy it. I don't believe for a single second I spend watching them that these two enjoy spending time together, and I don't understand why they would continue to after their bad first date. I especially can't wrap my head around Scott being willing to risk his life fighting a bunch of guys for Ramona when Scott doesn't even seem to like her. It's not just that Ramona doesn't seem interested in him. It's hard for me to believe that Scott likes her when she gives him no reason to.
Oh, it's because he's not really in love with her, he's just in love with the version of her that he's invented in his head. Okay, when are we presented with that version of Ramona? When is that version presented to us on the screen? What does Scott do when confronted with the contrast between his imagined version of Ramona and the real Ramona? The answer is nothing. None of that is made present within the story. None of it at all is even made mention of. So if your argument is, oh, he's not really in love with her, he's in love with the version of her in her head, who is that? What version is that? When does he describe that version? When do we see that version? It's a movie. We should be made aware of that version. We're being shown the movie from his perspective. We should be shown that version of Ramona. We should hear Scott say what he likes about that version of Ramona. None of that comes up. All of this whole argument that Scott's just in love with this invented version of Ramona, it's completely imaginary. It's as imaginary as this imaginary version of a Ramona you guys have imagined Scott imagining.
I've heard it suggested that Scott dates Ramona not because he enjoys it, but because he feels like it's what he deserves. But I don't believe that this is in any way supported by the text. Scott is both a complete narcissist and a total glutton. Everything he does for his own enjoyment, and he never expresses doubt that he deserves any of the good things in his life, even when other characters loudly do.
Scott, if your life had a face, I would punch it.
If Scott didn't enjoy spending time with Ramona, he wouldn't spend time with her.
As evidenced by him starting to avoid knives once he loses interest in that relationship.
Ramona's issue is her obsession with her own flaws, but Scott's problem is his complete inability to see fault in his own actions. That's not a guy who thinks he deserves bad things. He's a guy who thinks he only deserves good things, and when bad things happen to him, he can't understand why. It would be more accurate to suggest that Scott's willing to take whatever he can get, but that's what Knives represents, and Ramona exists as a counterpoint to Knives. Ramona represents Scott no longer settling for an unchallenging, uninteresting relationship with Knives, and pursuing something more challenging that interests him more. In the movie, Ramona's entire appeal is mysterious. To the viewer, and clearly to Scott himself, as we aren't shown anything else he might like about her. That being the character's entire appeal falls apart when you consider the following. Scott hasn't really learned anything about her by the end of the movie. By the time credits roll, Scott and Ramona's relationship ends up in exactly the same place it started. At the end of the movie, they say, okay, let's start over. Let's try again from the beginning. So what was the point of all the stuff that we just watched? Why did we watch all of that? If they're just back where they started at the beginning, they didn't go anywhere. Nobody went anywhere. Nobody did anything. Scott Pilgrim grows as a character, but other than Scott beating up a bunch of guys while Ramona watched, in terms of seeing Scott Pilgrim's central relationship grow, we've spent 112 minutes watching nothing.